At exactly 11:32 on the morning of November 29, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran knelt inside the extreme rear compartment of a B-17 flying fortress called Rikki-Tikki-Tabi through the narrow framing of his tail position. He watched German fighter aircraft closing in from every direction, their movements sharp and coordinated, like hornets converging on a single target. Moran was only 19 years old, a farm boy from rural Wisconsin. This was his first combat mission. That morning, the 8th Air Force had dispatched more than 300 heavy bombers across the North Sea toward Germany. Their objective was Bremen, a city packed with shipyards, aircraft factories, and submarine production facilities, one of the most heavily defended industrial centers in the Reich. German air defenses were fully alert. Within the first hour of the mission, 6 flying fortresses had already been destroyed. The tailgunner's position was the most isolated place on the aircraft. Moran sat on a narrow bicycle-style seat at the very end of the fuselage, separated from the rest of the crew by more than 40 feet of aluminum skin and structural framing. No one else could see him. No one could reach him. His only companions were 2.50 caliber machine guns and the enemy pilots attempting to kill him. A B-17 carried 10 men. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit. The navigator and bombardier occupied the nose. The flight engineer manned the top turret. The radio operator worked behind the bomb bay. 2 waist gunners stood at open windows on either side of the fuselage. Beneath the aircraft, a ball turret gunner hung suspended in a glass sphere. And at the very rear, alone and exposed, sat Eugene Moran. The tail gunner's task was brutally simple: defend the bomber's most vulnerable approach. German pilots had learned early in the war that a direct attack from behind placed them within the firing arc of only one defender. By late 1943, losses among American bomber crews had reached catastrophic levels. 2 months earlier, the second Schweinfurt raid had cost 60 flying fortresses in a single day, 600 airmen killed or captured in one afternoon. Bomber crews called deep missions into Germany milk runs to hell. The mathematics of survival were unforgiving. Completing 25 missions meant a crew could go home. Statistical analysis showed that the average crew lasted only 15. Some bomb groups were losing half their aircraft every month. Moran had enlisted on his 18th birthday. He grew up on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, working the land and watching aircraft pass overhead. He dreamed of flight. The Army Air Forces needed gunners, young men with fast reflexes, steady nerves, and experience with firearms. Farm boys who knew how to shoot. During gunnery training, Moran learned to track fast-moving targets while compensating for wind, altitude, and the speed of his own aircraft. He learned to fire in controlled bursts to prevent overheating. He memorized the silhouettes of enemy fighters, Messerschmitt, Bf-109s, and Focke-Wulf 190s until he could identify them instantly at long range. But no amount of training could prepare him for the reality of combat over Germany. At 24,000 feet, temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Thin air made every movement exhausting. German fighters attacked in disciplined waves, firing 20mm cannons that tore through aluminum skin as if it were paper. Rikki-Tikki-Tabi lifted off from Snetterton Heath in England as part of the 96th Bomb Group. The formation crossed the North Sea in tight defensive boxes, each bomber positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The theory was simple: massed firepower would drive enemy fighters away. In practice, a direct hit on one aircraft often damaged those flying nearby. As the formation approached Bremen, anti-aircraft fire erupted. Black flak bursts filled the sky. The bombers were forced to fly straight and level during the bomb run. Shrapnel ripped through wings and fuselages. Moran watched as a flying fortress ahead of them took a direct hit, folded in half, and fell out of formation. Rikki-Tikki-Tabi released its bombs, 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbling toward the factories below. The mission objective had been achieved. Now the crew only had to survive the return flight. As the formation turned back toward England, a flak burst struck Rikki-Tikki-Tabi's No. 2 engine. The propeller began to windmill uselessly. Airspeed dropped. Altitude bled away. A damaged bomber falling behind the formation was a death sentence. German fighter pilots waited for Moran saw them coming, Messerschmitts climbing from below, Focke-Wulfs diving from above. The flying fortress was about to face the enemy alone. In the tail position, Eugene Moran would be the first target. The initial attacks came from the 6 o'clock low position. Moran pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate and squeezed both triggers. His twin .50 caliber machine guns roared to life. Tracer rounds streaked toward the oncoming fighter. The German pilot broke off and rolled away. There were many more. The attackers came in pairs. One drew the gunner's attention. The other lined up a killing shot. Moran swung his guns from target to target. Spent brass casings piled around his knees. The smell of cordite filled the cramped compartment. Inside the aircraft, the temperature hovered near 43 degrees below zero. Moran wore an electrically heated flight suit, but the cold still penetrated. His breath crystallized on his oxygen mask. The guns grew hot from continuous fire while his fingers slowly went numb inside his gloves. The Luftwaffe pilots were veterans. They knew exactly how to destroy a B-17 first, damage the engines, Then eliminate the gunners. Finally, pour cannon fire into the fuselage until something vital failed. Moran heard the impacts before he felt their metal tearing, structure failing. Somewhere forward, one of the waist guns fell silent, then the other. The intercom dissolved into static and fragmented voices. Moran kept firing. A Focke-Wulf attacked from the 4 o'clock position. Moran tracked it and squeezed the triggers. The fighter's wing disintegrated. It spiraled downward, trailing smoke. His first confirmed kill. There was no time to acknowledge it. Cannon rounds tore through the tail section. One struck his left forearm, another hit his right. Blood soaked into his flight suit. The pain was immediate and intense, but his hand still worked. He could still grip the triggers. He glanced down at his parachute. It was shredded, multiple holes torn through the silk canopy. It was useless. If the bomber went down, he would fall for miles to his death. The attacks continued. Moran counted at least 15 fighters circling the crippled aircraft. Rikki-Tikki-Tabi continued to lose speed and altitude. In the nose section, navigator Jesse Orison was still alive, wounded but conscious. The pilot and co-pilot were dead at the controls. The flight engineer, radio operator, ball turret, gunner, and waist gunners were all dead. Only 2 men remained alive. Then another shell struck something critical. The aircraft shuddered violently. A grinding vibration ran through the airframe. Then came a sound. Moran would never forget the shriek of tearing aluminum. The fuselage split. Moran watched as the front of the aircraft separated and fell away, wings, engines, cockpit, and the bodies of his crewmates tumbling toward the German countryside far below. He was left alone in a severed tail section, wounded, parachute destroyed, falling from 24,000 feet. The severed tail section plunged through the sky, spinning violently as air tore through the shattered metal. Moran was slammed against the walls of the compartment, then thrown back into his seat as gravity shifted without warning. Pain tore through his shattered arms. Blood sprayed across the interior. The wind howled through the open rupture where the rest of the aircraft had once been attached. He should have been paralyzed with fear. Any rational man would have curled inward and waited for the inevitable. But Eugene Moran did something no one could have predicted. He kept fighting. German fighters were still circling overhead. They had watched the bomber break apart and descended to confirm the kill. Perhaps they were curious. Perhaps they were careless. Either way, they made a fatal error. They flew within range of a wounded tail gunner who refused to accept death. Moran pulled his machine guns back toward him. The spinning wreckage made aiming almost impossible. G-forces crushed him into his seat, then flung him sideways as the tail rotated. His arms were shattered. His parachute was destroyed. He was falling for miles through enemy airspace, and still, he fired. Tracer rounds arced wildly through the sky as the tail section tumbled. German pilots scattered, shocked by the sight of gunfire erupting from falling wreckage. One fighter took hits across its fuselage and broke away trailing smoke, diving toward the ground. The others pulled back, unwilling to press an attack against something that defied logic. Inside the tail section, the altimeter was shattered, but Moran could see the earth growing larger through the torn metal fields. Forests, roads, Germany rushing upward. The tail's stabilizers began to slow the descent. Instead of plummeting straight down, the wreckage started to glide. Crude aerodynamics created drag. The spinning eased. The fall became marginally controlled. Marginally, Moran estimated he was still descending at nearly 100 feet per second, fast enough to kill him, but slower than freefall. The stabilizers were buying him seconds, perhaps a minute. He used that time to stay alive. At 5,000 feet, then 3,000, then 1,000, Moran braced himself against the steel chest plate. He wrapped his shattered arms around the ammunition boxes, the only solid structure within reach. The ground surged closer. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at tremendous speed. Branches snapped like matchsticks. The vertical stabilizer caught on the trunk and tore away. The wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, shedding metal with every impact. Moran's head slammed into the steel frame. His vision erupted into white light. Ribs cracked. Bones bent in ways the human body was never meant to endure. The wreckage struck another tree, spun sideways, and finally slammed into the frozen ground. Then Skulens Eugene Moran was alive. Barely. He lay twisted inside the wreckage, unable to move. Both forearms were shattered in multiple places, bones protruding through torn flesh. His ribs were broken. A section of his skull had been torn away, leaving part of his brain exposed to the freezing air. Blood pooled beneath him, dark against the snow. The crash site lay in a forest roughly 15 miles south of Bremen, deep inside enemy territory. Moran was surrounded by people who had just watched American bombs destroy their city. He tried to move. His legs responded weakly. His arms were useless. Cold seeped into his body. Hypothermia would kill him if the wounds did not. Voices echoed through the trees. German voices. Soldiers emerged with rifles raised, surrounding the wreckage. They stared at the American airmen lying in the snow. One shouted orders. Another ran toward the road to summon an officer. Moran could not resist. He could barely breathe. They searched him roughly, ignoring his screams as they handled his shattered arms. They found his dog tags, his rank, his ruined parachute. Then they left him on the frozen ground while they inspected the wreckage. An officer arrived later. He looked at Moran and shook his head. The American was clearly dying, but orders were orders. Prisoners were to be captured if possible. They loaded Moran onto a wooden cart. No stretcher, no blankets, no medical care. The cart bounced along frozen roads for hours. Every jolt sent fresh agony through his broken body. The wound in his skull had stopped bleeding only because the cold had frozen the blood solid. He was delivered to a German military facility. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness. He remembered lying on a concrete floor. He remembered German voices discussing him as if he were already dead. No doctor came. No medic. No treatment. For 2 days, Moran lay on that floor. Infection set in. His arms turned purple and black. Gangrene began to spread. His exposed brain tissue swelled. Without surgery, he would die. On the 3rd day, he was moved again another cart. Another brutal journey. This time, he was taken to a prisoner of war hospital. A converted building used to hold wounded Allied airmen. The hospital was understaffed and undersupplied. German doctors performed triage. Those deemed salvageable were treated. Those considered beyond saving were left to die. Moran fell into the second category. But inside the hospital were 2 Serbian doctors, captured military physicians forced to treat prisoners with almost no equipment. They examined Moran and made a decision they would try. The surgery lasted 7 hours. There was no proper anesthesia, only local numbing agents that barely dulled the pain. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness as they cleaned infected tissue, set shattered bones with wire and pins, and removed fragments of skull. They covered his exposed brain with salvaged tissue and attached a crude metal plate. They told him the truth. The next 72 hours would decide everything. The fever came that night. His temperature climbed past 104 degrees. His body convulsed. He screamed names of dead crewmates. He begged warnings to men who would never hear them. The Serbian doctors stayed with him, pressing cold cloths to his head, forcing water between cracked lips. They had no antibiotics, no morphine, only patience. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Moran opened his eyes. He was alive. Recovery was slow and painful. 6 weeks later, he could walk. His arms remained weak. His skull plate caused constant headaches. But he was alive. He was transferred to Starlock Luft for barbed wire, guard towers, wooden barracks. Thousands of Allied airmen waited behind the wire. Moran survived starvation, rations, disease, and endless transfers between camps. Then came the hell ship. 200 men were forced into the unventilated hold of an aging freighter for 4 days. Darkness, filth, death. Bodies remained among the living. Men screamed. Men prayed. Some never woke up. Moran survived. In February 1945, German guards forced prisoners onto a winter evacuation march as Soviet forces advanced. Temperatures fell below zero. Anyone who collapsed was shot. The march lasted 86 days. It became known as the Black March. Nearly 1,500 prisoners died. Moran kept walking. On April 26, 1945, American troops intercepted the column. The guards surrendered. The prisoners stood in silence, unable to comprehend freedom. Moran weighed 93 pounds. The army confirmed the impossible. Eugene Moran had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute, one of only 3 Allied airmen to do so in the war. He returned home, married, farmed, raised 9 children. He spoke little of the war. In 2007, Wisconsin honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. A street was named after him. Eugene Moran died in 2014 at the age of 80. The tail gunner's position was the loneliest place on a flying fortress. On November 29, 1943, Eugene Moran occupied it. And when the world fell away beneath him, he kept fighting all the way down.